Sadducees. And they were a little bit like the elites. They tended to be wealthy. They tended to be from socially prominent families. They were people who were very, very well placed in the community in terms of their social standing. The Pharisees, we hear that word a lot also, tended to be more middle class and tended to be more humble in many ways in terms of their social standing. But the Sadducees were sort of the creme de la creme of the Jewish society. They included the royal family. The royal family among the Jews in Jesus' day, they were a wreck. They were a wreck. But they tended towards the party of the Sadducees. And as a result, the Sadducees tended to be very liberal on a whole lot of issues. They weren't crazy about the other books of the Bible than the books of Moses. They denied things like the application of certain kinds of tithing rules. And they tended towards a more libertarian view on things like behavior and ethics and morals. It's no wonder the royal family gravitated that way, because their own sexual preferences really liked that Sadducee way of looking at morals. They tended to be more in that direction, more accommodating of the sexual immorality of the royal family and of the day. And they denied specifically the resurrection. In fact, that's recorded several times in the New Testament. The Sadducees rejected the doctrine of the resurrection. And it's actually something confirmed from extra-biblical history. It's undeniably true that one of the things the Sadducees did was they denied the resurrection. And like upper categories of social life today, they tended to be fairly well educated. They tended to have very, very strong opinions that made them sort of part of the cultural left wing, if you will. So Jesus here in verse 27 encounters a group of these Sadducees who had come there to hear him. Now, they didn't just come to hear him because they wanted to know what he had to say. Certainly, they did not come to hear him because they were interested in following him. No, it says that they came intending to ask him a question, and it becomes very clear that they came intending to ask him a trick question. And their trick question actually turns into quite a revealing question. Look at verse 28. They asked Jesus a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies," see, they like to quote Moses. They thought they had a good handle on Moses. "Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife and died without children, and the second and the third took her, and likewise all 7 left no children and died. Afterward, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had her as wife." Now, it was intended to be a trick question. It's a little hard to follow, isn't it? It's so convoluted. It's so highly unlikely. I don't know if you remember the presidential debate on the other night, where one of the members of the panel asked, I think it was Mitt Romney or one of the Republicans running for office, what is your position on whether a state can outlaw contraception? And Mitt Romney said, "I don't know. Does some state want to outlaw contraception? I haven't heard of that movement." No state wants to outlaw contraception. And similarly, there was no situation quite like this one. It's so exaggerated, isn't it? I mean, 7 different marriages from one family. I mean, pity this poor woman. What an amazingly, extravagantly outlandish story it is. They didn't come with a legitimate question. They didn't come with hearts truly open to being taught. They came to trick Jesus. And so they lay out this absurd hypothetical question, disconnected really from any kind of reality. And so for that reason, their tricky question becomes a very revealing question. It is perfectly possible to ask Jesus sincere questions. It is very appropriate in church life to bring our questions to the Lord. Where else do we take them? We bring them to one another. We bring them to Christ. We pray about them. It's absolutely appropriate for a Christian to bring a question to Christ. It's absolutely appropriate for a searcher, a sincere searcher, to bring a question. We welcome questions. I mentioned what a joy Presbytery is. Well, one of the consistent joys at Presbytery for me is a young minister named Saji George. Saji is the pastor of another church plant not far from here, over in North Dallas, not far from Trinity. And Saji has a ministry specifically aimed at people who have questions. He's called the church, and his church has called itself St. Thomas the Doubter. And the idea is to encourage people to bring their questions, to wrestle honestly, sincerely, transparently with tough questions. There's nothing wrong with bringing a question to Christ. There's nothing wrong with bringing a tough question. So there's a wonderful place for that in our modern day when people are confronted with teaching like John Spong's. It's helpful to have a place where they can come and be engaged intellectually, not to have the door slammed in their face because they dare to ask a question. There's nothing wrong asking a question. But our questions reveal a lot about us. You'll notice this as you share your faith. There's a very easy to pick up kind of question which is insincere and which is aimed at causing a Christian to stumble. Those silly questions that people throw out when they're confronted with the claims of Christ. Can God make a rock so heavy that he can't move it? That's the level of questions you occasionally hear from people. There's no way to satisfactorily answer that question. It's not really a good question. There is no such thing. So could he do it? It's a hypothetical question. Well, that kind of question is a revealing question. Now, I'm not saying we slam the door necessarily on that kind of question, but be aware of it. Jesus is certainly aware of it, and he answers based on his discernment. And so we'll want to be aware of those kinds of revealing questions, questions that reveal an insincere heart or not taking the engagement with Christ very seriously. We'll need to be on guard for that kind of situation, those revealing questions which help us to know what's really going on in a person's heart and mind. Of course, we're fallen and we get it wrong. Jesus didn't, so we want to err on the side of patience and tolerance. But there is a place for saying, this conversation isn't going anywhere. Let's take a break and come back to it another time. That's an appropriate thing for a fallen, limited Christian like me or you to do as we engage questions from people. Their question was revealing in another way, because it reveals they just don't understand the resurrection. They were interpreting the resurrection in the flattest, most literal, most absurdly earthly way. They bring to the Lord a question about the resurrection in terms of serial remarriage. They don't understand what the resurrection is all about. They're interpreting it as merely some kind of continuation of life today. Something like resuscitated corpses. Something like the idea that all the resurrection implies is that a dead body comes back to life. Now, in the resurrection, dead bodies do return to life. We need to be clear on that. Read 1 Corinthians 15 to see how truly earthy the resurrection is. It does involve the return of our human bodies, but in resurrection life, not merely continuation of this life. And so the Lord answers them beginning in verse 34. He's listened to their absurd hypothetical, and this is what he says. The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. For they cannot die anymore because they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. Now this is a great deal to take in. Jesus makes it plain that the resurrection is more than